books didn't burn. They were edited, quietly, cleanly, and on purpose. And inside the Whitney Mansion's library, someone made sure the most dangerous sentences would never be read aloud again. This is the Whitney Mansion, an elite Gilded Age library where pages were deliberately removed, and the controversy is real. The damage wasn't age, fire, or accident. The mini verdict is simple. This was human intent, and the first hard proof is physical. Across different volumes and publication years, conservators found the same signature of precision: clean tiers that follow the grain of the paper, dedications lifted from the front matter without breaking the binding, and marginal notes selectively erased while the surrounding ink remains intact. That pattern doesn't happen by chance. It happens when someone knows exactly what to cut and exactly what to leave behind. What we don't know yet is who decided which words were unsafe inside that house, and what those words threatened to expose. In the present day, restoration begins like any other careful operation. Gloves, humidity control, light levels dialed down until the room feels more like a vault than a parlor. The shelves still carry the weight of an era that believed wealth could outlast time. Original woodwork, gilt titles, family book plates, the faint imprint where fingertips return to the same passages for decades. But the deeper the team goes, the more the silence starts to look engineered. A biography missing a single E chapter, removed without damaging the sewn spine. A collection of letters with the salutation intact, yet the names in the dedication are gone, as if a blade refused to let two people be recorded in the same sentence. A travel volume whose scandalous pages are missing, but whose index still points to them like a witness who refuses to forget. And this is where the Gilded Age context matters. Between the 1870s and 1910, America perfected the art of public grandeur and private containment. The Panic of 1893 didn't just collapse markets, it rearranged loyalties. Newspapers grew into weapons, society columns became courtrooms, and a single rumor could ruin a marriage, a partnership, a political future. Families learned to manage narratives the way rail barons managed routes, controlling what moved, what stopped, and what disappeared. Sometimes letters were burned. Sometimes archives were transferred under friendly names. Sometimes a quiet internal decision was made, an agreement that never reached a contract, a settlement that never reached a judge. And sometimes the safer solution was simpler. Remove the page, leave the book, and let history keep turning with a missing heartbeat. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion? If this case reminds you of another sealed room or forgotten heir, share it below, because this channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase, so subscribe before you lose sight of it. And if you want this investigation to keep going, leave a like. These stories survive when people insist on looking closer. Because when a library is edited, it isn't paper that vanishes. It's memory, made selective, made obedient. And in a moment, we're going to step into the Whitney Mansion's restoration process and follow the evidence book by book, until the absence itself starts to read like a confession. To understand why a few missing pages can feel like a crime scene, you have to step back into what a private library meant in the American Gilded Age, when wealth wasn't just accumulated, it was curated, defended, and rehearsed. In mansions like the Whitneys, the library was never merely a room for reading. It was a control room dressed as culture, a place where guests were invited to admire taste, while the real function sat quietly behind the spines: correspondence, access, leverage. In a world where the right introduction could open a boardroom and the wrong rumor could close a marriage, a library became something closer to a vault. Except the currency wasn't gold. It was names, favors, and the paper trail of what the family had promised, threatened, or denied. You can see it in the way these rooms were built between 1870 and 1910. Heavy doors, thick carpets that softened footsteps, lamps positioned to flatter faces more than pages. The shelves were arranged like a social map. Diplomatic memoirs near political philosophy. Investment manuals tucked beside respectable histories. Poetry displayed where visitors would notice, while private volumes lived higher, out of casual reach, as if height itself could be a form of permission. In the evenings, when the rest of the house moved toward music rooms and dining halls, the library stayed behind like a second heartbeat, quiet enough for a confession, formal enough for an agreement, intimate enough to ruin someone if the wrong person opened the wrong cover. And that's the detail modern restorers keep coming back to, because missing pages in the Whitney Library don't behave like random decay. The tiers aren't chaotic. They're consistent, almost disciplined, as if someone learned a method and repeated it until it became ritual. Specialists notice the same targets again and again: frontispieces, dedication pages, annotated margins, and the final leaves where personal notes often hid like a signature you didn't want on the record. Those weren't the pages most readers cared about, but they were the pages that proved a relationship existed. They were where a name could be written in a familiar hand, where someone could tuck a folded letter between chapters, knowing the spine would hold it like a secret, where a diary could be improvised in the blank end papers, not meant for publication, meant for survival. Old money households did this constantly. Books were not only read, they were used. A novel could carry a telegram. A prayer book could hold a photograph. A volume of speeches could conceal an invitation, stamped with a crest that never appeared in official guest lists. A signature inside the cover could explain why someone kept visiting, why a partnership formed, why a daughter married where she did, why an heir suddenly vanished from polite conversation. The public would see a family name in the society column. The family would see the truth in private ink. When reputations were fragile and inheritance law was merciless, the difference between an acknowledged connection and a denied one could decide everything. A hidden heir didn't need to be born in scandal to become dangerous. Sometimes all it took was proof that a powerful man promised something he later tried to erase. A dedication reading to W with gratitude could be harmless, or it could be the thread that ties a respected legacy to a forbidden room, an unspoken agreement, a relationship that was never meant to be visible. The Gilded Age was polite on the surface, brutal underneath, and families learned early that the safest scandal is the scandal that never becomes evidence. That's why so many elite households treated public archives like theater and private archives like strategy. Official records could be managed, deeds filed under intermediaries, trusts structured to obscure beneficiaries, donations announced loudly to drown out quieter transactions. Newspapers were not merely reported to, they were fed. Friendly editors received corrections. Society writers were invited to dinners where the menu was as deliberate as the conversation. If a rumor appeared at breakfast, it could be softened by nightfall, replaced with a more flattering narrative, supported by witnesses who suddenly remembered events differently. And if a written proof threatened to outlive the spin, paper itself became the enemy. There were simple methods, and then there were careful ones. Burning a letter leaves ash and questions, but removing a page leaves a book that still looks complete from across the room. It turns the object into a silent witness, present, respectable, and permanently unable to testify. A blade slipped under a paste down, a thin spatula lifting a bookplate without tearing the cloth, a gentle steaming that loosens adhesive just enough to peel away a name. Someone who knew bindings could do it cleanly. Someone who didn't would leave violence behind. The Whitney Library shows cleanliness. It shows experience. It shows time. If you stand in a room like this, you start to notice how power prefers subtlety. The air itself feels organized. Even now in the present-day restoration, there's a hush that isn't just dust and age. It's the way thick walls hold sound, the way a house built for privacy resists being overheard. A conservator turns a page and pauses, not dramatically, just long enough for the glove to tighten at the fingertips. There's a soft rasp where paper should meet paper, a margin that looks too empty. The faint shadow of ink that once pressed into fibers now scrubbed away so selectively it almost seems courteous. The lamp catches it at an angle and you see what the room was trying to hide. Not damage, but subtraction. And the most unsettling part is what those missing targets imply. In public libraries, vandalism tends to chase headlines, sensational chapters, controversial passages. Here, the erasures lean toward intimacy, front matter, end papers, the places where people left traces of themselves when they believed no one else would look. It's not the storyline that's being censored. It's the relationships around the storyline. The private web that turns a mansion into a machine. Alliances, compromises, debts, quiet favors traded for lifelong protection. A dark legacy rarely survives on grand lies alone. It survives on small, careful edits. You start to picture the original scene, because the architecture invites it. A winter evening sometime after the Panic of 1893, when nervous money moved behind closed doors and the city outside felt less obedient than it used to. A fire low in the grate. A man standing too close to the shelves, not browsing, hunting. A woman's gloved hand resting on the back of a chair, still, as if movement might make the room listen. Someone speaks in a tone used for contracts rather than comfort. Someone else nods without agreeing out loud. The kind of moment that never appears in memoirs, but that changes inheritances, marriages, careers. Then a book is opened, not for reading, for retrieval. A folded page slides. Out, thin, decisive, dangerous. The cover closes. The room returns to being beautiful. Would you have the courage to consult a library knowing someone decided before you what you were allowed to read? That's the question this mansion keeps forcing on everyone who steps into its quiet. Because if these pages were removed, someone had to choose which pages were dangerous. Someone had to recognize which names, which dedications, which marginal notes could become evidence, and someone had to believe that future eyes, our eyes, were the threat worth preparing for. What happens next is where the story stops being abstract, because as the restoration team logs the damage volume by volume, one item doesn't fit the pattern of polite erasure. It's a document sleeve tucked behind a row of uniform bindings, not cataloged, not labeled the way a careful archivist labels anything. Inside is a thin sheet, ledger paper, aged to a brittle tan, and along the margin runs a list of names written in an O. Old, steady hand. Most are intact. One is not. One has been scraped until the fibers lift, ink ghosting underneath like a bruise that won't fade, and above that wound the paper bears a faint impression where a seal once pressed, just enough to suggest it wasn't meant to leave the room at all. The ledger sleeve changes the temperature of the room, not by drama, but by what it forces the team to do next. Stop guessing and start measuring. The conservators don't speak much after that. There's the soft click of a pencil against a clipboard, the controlled slide of an archival tray across felt, the careful way a gloved thumb pauses at a page edge as if listening for resistance. In the Whitney Mansion's library, the evidence isn't theatrical, it's procedural. It's what you notice when you stop looking at books as stories and start treating them as objects that have been handled with intent. Under raking light, the missing leaves stop looking like absence and start looking like work. The cuts sit close to the spine, almost always within that narrow zone where a casual reader would never pull with confidence, where paper fibers hold tight to the sewing. They're clean, confident, and consistent. No tearing outward, no frantic ripping, no uneven gouges that would suggest haste. Whoever did this understood the architecture of a book. They knew that the safest way to remove a page is to take it where the binding hides the violence. Up close, you can see it. A faint, linear compression. Where a blade rode along the fold, the kind of pressure that leaves the paper slightly burnished, slightly darker, like skin rubbed too long in the same place. In one volume, the gutter margin shows a whisper of adhesive disturbed and then smoothed again, as if someone cleaned up after themselves, not for beauty, but for plausible deniability. The team starts cataloging the injuries the way investigators catalog patterns: the proximity to the hinge, the angle of the cut, the thickness of the removed leaf. Some books are missing a single frontispiece, others lose their final blanks. Those quiet pages at the end where readers used to leave a date, a note, a name. A few have something stranger. Neutral paper inserted where an original leaf once lived, trimmed to match, toned just enough to avoid drawing the eye, but blank in a way that feels almost insulting. A substitution like that isn't preservation, it's camouflage. In one case, the replacement sheet carries a watermark that doesn't belong to the book's era. Modern, faint, perfectly innocent. An intrusion that only appears once you hold it to light and let the lamp reveal what the room hoped you wouldn't check. What makes it worse is the patience. There's no evidence of improvisation. The cuts don't vary the way amateur vandalism varies. The spacing doesn't drift. It's the same choreography repeated across decades of volumes, as if the library had its own internal rule. Remove the proof, leave the facade. This is the kind of discipline you associate with institutions, not tempers. The kind of habit you associate with a house that learned early how to survive scandal by outliving the witnesses. And then a second pattern begins to surface. One that shifts the mystery from technique to motive. The altered books aren't random selections of literature. They cluster around names that traveled in the same social atmosphere as the Whitneys. Authors who wrote for the kinds of magazines that sat on drawing room tables. Editors who attended the same dinners, memoirists whose harmless society recollections were read like intelligence briefings in the right hands. Some volumes are the polished kind of history a wealthy home would display. Great men, great wars, great institutions, yet even those have personal material targeted. A dedication page removed, a presentation inscription lifted cleanly, a margin stripped of commentary. Other titles are more intimate. Collections of letters, privately printed addresses, books that would have circulated through clubs and salons before they ever reached a storefront. And when the staff cross-references publication dates, book plates, and acquisition notes, small markings that collectors leave behind like fingerprints, the timeline stretches across the very decades when America's elite became skilled at managing their own legend. Because the Gilded Age did not only build mansions, it built narratives. It built the idea that money could be moral if it wore the right clothes and funded the right museums. But beneath that, the era's real currency was connection. Who introduced whom, who vouched for whose son, who quietly paid whose debt, who ensured a divorce stayed discreet, who kept a name off a ballot, who made a rumor die before breakfast. Those networks didn't live in public archives. Public archives were for what could be defended. Private libraries were for what needed to be controlled. You can almost see how it worked. A visit after dinner, when the parlor has emptied and the servants are resetting glassware in the distance, their movements softened by thick curtains and thicker etiquette. A guest lingering too long by the shelves, not browsing, but scanning, looking for a familiar spine, a privately gifted volume, a book that carries a trace of someone else's handwriting, a host standing at a slight angle, polite, casual, watching without making it obvious. A brief pause when the book opens and a front matter page reveals a name in ink. Too personal, too specific, too close to a relationship the family would rather let fade into rumor. The book closes. The conversation changes. And later, perhaps weeks later, the library corrects itself. This is how Golden Age secrets survive. Not through grand conspiracies, but through quiet maintenance. Families with that level of power didn't need to erase everything. They only needed to erase enough that future readers would doubt their own instincts. Remove the dedication and the relationship becomes unproven. Remove the marginal note and the implication becomes speculation. Replace a final leaf and a private confession becomes lost to time. That's the logic of erased records. Not silence, but selective silence. The kind that preserves respectability while starving inquiry. Even the public record could be guided. The progressive era made certain questions dangerous. The panic of 1907 made certain partnerships fragile. Newspapers could be courted, advertisers could be pressured. Editors could be invited into comfort until their curiosity softened. And when something leaked anyway, The response didn't always look like denial. Sometimes it looked like distraction. A donation announced with fanfare, a gala photographed at the right angle, a carefully placed story about philanthropy that shifted attention from the whisper traveling under it. It wasn't just the mansion that was designed. The perception of the mansion was designed. In that context, the Whitney Library reads, less like a collection and more like a sensitive archive that happened to be shelved. The modifications target the human layer of the books, the proof of who touched them, who gave them, who annotated them, who hid things inside them. And that's why the team begins searching for what isn't on the shelf as much as what is. The missing inserts, the removed enclosures, the absent photographs that used to sleep between pages. They start checking gutters for fiber remnants. They check bindings for, disturbances. They map which shelves hold the most altered volumes and notice something else. The clustering isn't only social, it's spatial. Certain sections of the room show more editing than others, as if there were zones of privacy within privacy, strata of access in a room that already existed to exclude. A conservator lifts one of the altered books and, for the first time, hesitates before opening it. Not fear, just calculation. The spine creaks in a controlled way, old glue flexing like a quiet complaint. The pages fan with that dry, elegant whisper rag paper makes when it has survived a century. And there it is again. The same surgical absence, the same smooth edge near the stitching, the same polite emptiness where a dedication should have been. Someone didn't just remove words. Someone removed the social proof that words were ever exchanged between specific people. You have to ask yourself, gently, the way this mansion forces you to ask everything gently, would you trust your own conclusions in a library where someone decided ahead of you what was safe to know? Because once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. Every clean cut suggests a decision. Every replaced leaf suggests planning. Every erased margin suggests panic disguised as taste. And behind those decisions sits the ugliest implication of all, that the family feared not just scandal, but lineage. Who belonged, who didn't, who might claim something, who might testify to a promise that was never meant to harden into evidence. That's why the investigation can't stay inside the books. If the library was censored, the motives won't be found in literature alone. They'll be found where families actually make decisions, in correspondence, in estate ledgers, in legal memoranda, in private minutes that never reach the public clerk. They'll be found in what was transferred, what was refiled, what was misplaced, what was burned with a kind of ceremonial calm. The books are only the surface. The real record, if it still exists, will be elsewhere. Behind a door, inside a box, in a part of the house that was never meant to host guests. And the mansion offers its own dark hint of where to look. When the team returns to the document sleeve and lays that scraped name under magnification, the fibers reveal parallel scoring, deliberate abrasion, repeated strokes, careful enough to remove ink without tearing through. But the most unsettling detail appears when they slide the sheet a fraction. To the left, beneath the erased line, the paper bears a faint, embossed impression, as if something heavier once rested there, an attached seal, a clipped enclosure, a secondary slip that was removed long ago. On the back of the sheet, pressed into the grain like a memory that won't confess, is the outline of a rectangular label that no longer exists, and at its edge a single letter remains in dark ink. Just one, caught where the scraping stopped, as if the hand doing the erasing decided it was safer to leave a fragment than risk tearing the page and admitting what had been done. The moment that single surviving letter shows itself on the scraped ledger sheet, the team stops treating the Whitney Library as a mystery of books and starts treating it as a managed system. Books can be altered in private, but systems leave paperwork. Somewhere in this mansion's long life, through winters when coal smoke thickened the corridors, through summers when linen curtains held back Fifth Avenue. Glare. Someone had to order supplies, schedule repairs, approve staff hours, and account for what belonged to the house. And that's where the investigation turns quietly into the back rooms of the Gilded Age. not ballrooms or salons, but the administrative spine that made the performance possible. They find it where these things always live. An estate office that was never designed to be romantic. A narrow room off a service corridor, the kind of space built for control rather than comfort. The smell is different here. Old paste, dry paper, a faint metallic edge from rusting fasteners. Boxes labeled in a hand that changes over decades. Stacked folios that carry the weight of routine. Maintenance lists, restoration notes, property inventories, receipts for carpentry and upholstery, orders for lamp chimneys, hinges, locks. The quiet in this room isn't the theatrical hush of a library. It's the silence of bureaucracy. Thick, patient, and often more revealing than the objects it describes. If the Whitney books were truly damaged, you'd expect someone to have written it down. These families documented everything that could be framed as responsible stewardship. A loose banister becomes repaired. A cracked plaster medallion becomes restored. Even small domestic inconveniences appear in neat language, because the paper trail itself was part of the legacy. Proof the house was cared for. Proof the estate was managed. Proof nothing unraveled on their watch. So the team begins with a simple comparison. The physical condition of the altered volumes versus what the records admit. And that's where the absence becomes loud. There are plenty of notes about the library, dusting schedules, furniture shifts, a line about regulating humidity near exterior walls, periodic binding adjustments with the bland tone of someone ordering fresh curtains. But there is no detailed mention of damaged books, no itemized accounting of missing leaves, no acknowledgement of torn frontispieces. Nothing like the careful descriptions you would expect from people who counted silverware by the piece. Instead, there are generic phrases, adjustments necessary, minor corrections, materials stabilized, language that reads like an umbrella held over something messy, the kind of wording that keeps an audit calm, the kind that keeps trustees from asking questions at the wrong dinner. It's not what's written that gives it away at first. It's the consistency of what isn't, page after page of tidy documentation, and yet the one thing physically obvious in the library, the surgical absence inside multiple volumes, never becomes an official problem. It exists in the room, but not on the paper, as if the estate's administrative voice was instructed to speak around it. Then, tucked between routine maintenance entries, a line appears that changes everything. Not shouted, not underlined, just present, like a confession that didn't realize it was confessing. The wording is cautious, almost clinical, removal preventive of material sensitive. No dramatic explanation, no list of titles, no reason offered. Just the acknowledgement that something was removed, not because it was rotten, but because it was risky. Preventive removal, sensitive material. It reads like a policy, not a reaction. Like a decision made at a table with good lighting and steady hands. The room reacts without anyone needing to narrate it. A conservator's finger pauses just above the line before touching the page, as if contact might smear it away. A pencil stops mid-note. The only sound for a moment is paper settling against paper. That soft, dry movement old documents make when disturbed. Someone photographs the line twice, once straight on, once at an angle, capturing the indentation of the type and the slight unevenness of ink, the mechanical certainty of a machine that does not improvise. Someone else flips back to the previous entry, then forward again, as if hoping the phrase will change into something easier. Because that sentence doesn't belong to time, it belongs to fear of reading. In the Gilded Age, people often imagine secrecy as locked doors and whispered scandals. But the most effective secrecy was administrative. Families didn't only hide what they feared, they trained the household to handle it correctly. Servants learned what not to repeat. Secretaries learned what not to file. Estate managers learned what to summarize in ways that couldn't be subpoenaed or misinterpreted. And when the progressive era sharpened public scrutiny, muckrakers digging, newspapers competing, society columns turning into quiet weapons, these houses became even more disciplined. A dark legacy doesn't survive a century by accident. It survives because the record-keeping was as curated as the art. That's why the phrase, Preventive removal hits harder than any rumor. It implies forethought. It implies a threshold was crossed where the danger wasn't that something had been damaged, but that someone might discover it and understand what it meant. It implies the library was never simply a collection of books. It was a sensitive archive, monitored the way one monitors inheritances, reputations, and the question of who belongs inside a family name. And that question, belonging, has always been where Gilded Age power becomes brittle. This was the era of trusts and legacies built to outlast bodies. Wills carefully drafted to protect the proper line. Marriages arranged as mergers. Disinheritance used as a disciplinary tool. A whisper about a hidden heir could travel through clubrooms faster than a train schedule. All it took was proof. One dedication, one note in a margin, one letter folded into a volume and forgotten. Proof could make a private promise public. Proof could turn a sealed room into a courtroom. So the team follows the administrative trail the way you follow a seam in fabric. They look for who signed the logs. They compare handwriting and margins. Small initials, quick notations made at the end of long days. They trace the chain of responsibility. A steward, a secretary, a trustee, a family member. They check whether the preventive removal coincides with anything outside the mansion, an estate transition, a sudden marriage, a death, a lawsuit that never fully surfaced, a newspaper incident that appeared briefly and then vanished under more flattering headlines. They scan dates around the financial shocks that made certain alliances urgent. The panic of 1893 tightening control, the panic of 1907 making even old money cautious, the shift toward tighter reputational management as the country's mood grew less obedient to wealth. And as they cross-reference, they notice another familiar pattern of erased records. When the writing gets close to specifics, the language retreats. Names become parties. Objects become materials. Actions become adjustments. It's the grammar of concealment, what you use when you need a record to exist, but you don't want it to testify. There are references to restoration that never specify what was restored. There are mentions of library review that never list which volumes were reviewed. There are notes about binding work that never name a binder. This isn't sloppy paperwork. Sloppy paperwork is chaotic. This is careful paperwork, tidy, minimal, designed to look responsible while remaining useless to a curious outsider. A Golden Age secret doesn't ask to be believed. It asks only to be unprovable. And still, that one phrase sits there like a splinter. Preventive removal of material sensitive. Someone typed it. Someone approved it. Someone assumed it would stay within the estate's closed circuit, safe among people trained to see and not speak. That assumption is what time is broken, because modern restoration is a kind of reading that can't be controlled. Light reveals watermarks. Magnification reveals abrasion. Paper fiber remembers pressure. The building itself remembers through storage rooms, forgotten envelopes, carbon copies that were never meant to survive long enough to matter. The mansion is full of silent witnesses, and they don't all obey the old rules anymore. The team pulls adjacent folders, looking for what the estate might have filed under safer categories. They find routine inventories, furniture, paintings, rugs, meticulously described down to fabric and frame. They find lists of repairs to doors and locks, the kind of records you keep when you care about access. And that detail begins to echo against the library's spatial pattern. Zones of higher editing, sections where altered volumes cluster like they were kept close to someone's control. When records obsess over locks and hinge replacements but avoid describing what's been removed from books, it suggests the house knew exactly where its vulnerabilities were. Somewhere in the paperwork, another hint surfaces, small, almost nothing. A notation about rekeying a service door. Near the library corridor, a line about storage adjustment in an adjacent room, the kind of administrative language that could mean moving chairs or moving evidence. The same bland tone used to hide a significant act inside a harmless phrase. The same tone that kept scandals quiet in the Gilded Age. Not denial, but normalization. If you've been listening closely, you can feel the direction the story is pushing. The books were edited with blades. The records were edited with language. And when something is removed preventively, the threat is not time. It's the moment someone reads with the wrong kind of attention. So the team does what the old system never anticipated. They treat the administrative files like the books, searching for the place where something has been lifted cleanly. They hold pages to the lamp, looking for impressions where attachments used to sit. They check for staple holes without staples. They follow discoloration, rectangles of cleaner paper where a document once covered the surface for decades. And finally, in a folder that should contain nothing more than routine property inventory addenda, they find a sheet with an obvious gap, a torn-out corner where a reference number would have been, and a faint typed line that stops mid-word, as if the machine ran out of courage. Pinned behind it, caught between the folder and the backing board like someone forgot to retrieve the last piece, is a thin cardstock slip, the kind used for internal indexing. On it, in a neat hand, is a location note. Library, north wall, cabinet. Beneath that, a second line has been vigorously crossed out, ink worked over until the paper fibers roughen, but not rough enough to destroy what the light still reveals. Under the scribble, a single word continues to surface at certain angles, restricted, and beside it a small sketched rectangle that looks less like a cabinet and more like a door. A door that, according to the public-facing descriptions of the house, was never supposed to exist. And the only thing left in the room after that discovery is the sound of pages turning slower than before, as if the mansion itself is waiting to see what you decide to read next. The index slip with restricted crossed out doesn't feel like a clue you're supposed to find. It feels like something that survived by accident, the way a single ash-gray photograph survives when an entire drawer is cleaned out too quickly. The team lays it beside the altered volumes, and suddenly, the Whitney Library stops being a room full of mutilated books and becomes something more intimate and more dangerous. A place where people once used literature as camouflage for private exchange. Because in a Gilded Age mansion, the most compromising words were rarely written on official stationery. They lived in the margins, in the front matter, on the blank leaves no one catalogued. They traveled inside books precisely because books moved without suspicion. A visitor could borrow a volume and return it with a folded note between chapters. A secretary could reshelve a title and, with it, deliver a message without ever speaking it aloud. A hostess could offer a guest a book with a pleasant smile, the kind of gesture that reads as culture while functioning as instruction. These rooms were built for reading, yes, but also for the quieter forms of negotiation that kept fortunes stable and scandals contained. When the restorers re-examined the damaged volumes with that idea in mind, the absences begin to look less like censorship and more like cleanup. The pages most often taken, frontispieces, dedication leaves, final blanks, are the very places where a private life tends to leak. A dedication isn't just a sentimental line, it's a recorded connection. A marginal note isn't just commentary, it's a trace of who was present, who disagreed, who knew too much, who wanted a reminder to remain close to the spine where strangers wouldn't glance. And those final leaves at the back, those, quiet, convenient blanks, were the Gilded Age's informal diary pages, where a hand could write a date, a name, a grievance, a confession, then close the cover and let the shelf protect it. Families like the Whitneys understood the power of that kind of hiding place. The public record was manageable, but it was not always controllable. Court filings could be requested, newspapers could be archived, clerks could be bribed, yes, but clerks could also talk. What couldn't be demanded was what was never formally filed. A letter slipped into a book doesn't become a document. It becomes an object that can be denied. A note written in the margin can be dismissed as someone else's hand. And a private confession sealed between pages can sit for decades without a single ledger acknowledging it ever existed. That's why the team's attention shifts to something subtle they'd noticed earlier and only now understand. Old adhesive, not in the places where bindings are normally repaired, but in strange intentional traces near the inner hinges and along certain end papers. Under magnification, the residue isn't random. It forms narrow bands, the width of a pasted insert. In one volume, there's a faint rectangular shadow where something once rested flush against the paper for years, protected from air and light, leaving the surrounding fibers slightly darker. In another, you can see where a thin card was once anchored, removed cleanly, but not cleanly enough to erase the history of contact. The library doesn't just show missing pages, it shows missing attachments. And once you recognize that, you begin to imagine what those attachments likely were, because the Gilded Age had its own vocabulary of private paper. Letters in thin stationery, folded into thirds, the crease lines sharp and permanent. Calling cards with a monogram pressed deep, meant to be seen and remembered. Telegram slips pasted for safekeeping, because the message mattered and the paper was fragile. A small note in pencil, short, economical, written quickly in a corridor and hidden in a book because the servants' eyes were everywhere. A visitor's remark, informal, dangerous, scribbled and tucked away because it made someone look foolish or cruel. A confession that would never survive a direct conversation, preserved instead where it could be denied and retrieved later. This is where the Whitney Mansion's edited silence becomes a family story rather than a restoration problem, because the kind of content that gets ripped from a book is rarely literary. It's relational. It's the record of who stood too close, who promised too much, who threatened to expose the wrong thing at the wrong time. It's the paper evidence of internal conflict. Siblings disputing an inheritance, trustees questioning a marriage settlement, a parent rewriting a legacy under pressure. It's the trace of a visitor who saw more than they were supposed to see and wrote it down in a way that could later be weaponized. It's the sort of thing that turns a Gilded Age mansion into a house of silent witnesses, each shelf holding a version of the family that the public never met. And the moment you accept that, the pattern of removals becomes almost chillingly reasonable. If the library functioned as a private exchange hub, then it would eventually become a target for historical cleaning. Not because someone hated books, but because someone feared what the books had been used to carry. The more the family's public image mattered, philanthropy, museums, boards, social respectability, the more urgent it became to remove anything that contradicted the official narrative. A dark legacy can tolerate rumors. What it cannot tolerate is proof. You can see the logic in the administrative phrasing you already heard: preventive removal of sensitive material. It's not the language of a repairman. It's the language of a household that understood reputation as infrastructure. In the Gilded Age, protecting a name was not an emotional impulse. It was a strategy. Newspapers could be managed, but private paper could not be allowed to survive uncontrolled. If a marginal note implied an affair, a secret payment, a promised inheritance, or a hidden heir, then that note wasn't merely embarrassing, it was destabilizing. It could redirect wealth. It could rewrite lineage. It could turn a sealed room into a scandal, and a scandal into litigation. So the question becomes sharper, quieter, more personal than any headline. If you held an annotation that could compromise an entire family, would you speak, or would you stay silent? That choice is what these rooms are built to pressure. It's what the Gilded Age trained people to do: swallow what they knew, keep their posture, and let the official story win. The mansion doesn't force you with threats. It persuades you with comfort, with access, with the soft implication that certain truths are impolite. And still, the physical evidence refuses to be polite. One of the restorers takes a thin bone folder and lifts the edge of an end paper where the adhesive residue is strongest. Not tearing, never tearing, just coaxing, letting the old paste separate at its weakest point. The room answers with a small sound, like a dry leaf breaking. Behind the lifted layer, there's a faint pencil line, incomplete, as if someone began writing and then stopped when footsteps entered the hall. The graphite is pale, almost gone, but under angled light, it holds. They don't read it out loud. They copy it carefully, letter by letter, as if speech would make it real too quickly. And the fragment is maddeningly small, part of a name, part of a date, the beginning of a sentence that never finishes. It's the kind of half-truth that makes every other erased record feel intentional. It's the kind of trace that suggests the library wasn't just a place where secrets were stored. It was a place where secrets were actively moved, inserted, retrieved, replaced, like currency changing hands, in the quietest room of the house. Which brings us to the sober part of the investigation, the part the mansion has been steering us toward from the beginning. Knowing what was removed isn't enough. Someone ordered the removal. Someone decided which traces mattered. Someone knew what could be tolerated as rumor and what had to disappear as evidence. And the person who made that decision would not have been acting alone. In homes like this, orders rarely appear as shouted commands. They appear as instructions folded into routine, spoken softly to an estate manager, typed once into a maintenance log, filed under language so bland it can't be challenged. So the team returns to the administrative records with a new purpose, scanning for names that repeat near library-related entries, looking for the signature that follows adjustments, review, preventive removal. They check who had the authority to classify something as sensitive. They check which restorations coincide with deaths, marriages, inheritances, the moments when families rewrite themselves. They look for the hand that could edit both books and paperwork, and in a file marked with nothing more provocative than Household 1908, they find a photograph inventory list meant for insurance, portraits, frames, locations, values. Most entries are intact, but one line has been struck through so aggressively the ink has bled into the fibers. The title remains readable: Library, North Wall, Portrait. The subject does not. Where the name should be, there is only a rough black scar, and beside it, in the margin, a tiny note in a different hand. Moved. Do not display. The next line, almost hidden at the bottom edge, is a reference number that points to a storage location, one that doesn't appear on any public-facing floor plan of the mansion. The crossed-out portrait line is the kind of edit that tells you the house didn't merely hide paper, it hid people. Moved. Do not display. 4 words, written in the same calm tone you'd use for a broken lamp, but applied to a face. Someone once meant to be seen at eye level in the Whitney Library, then quietly relocated into the mansion's private darkness. That's when the restoration team stops searching for a single culprit and starts watching the structure of decision itself, because in families like this, censorship was never announced. It was agreed to. The Gilded Age did not handle reputational risk with public statements. It handled it with private alignment. A small circle, heirs, counsel, estate administrators, would gather where the walls were thick and the servants were trained not to linger. Not a dramatic meeting, not a conspiracy with raised voices. The sound would be softer than you'd expect. A spoon against porcelain, a chair leg nudged an inch, the dry slide of an envelope across polished wood. The house would keep breathing around them while a future version of the family was negotiated in sentences that never entered the public record. Because a fortune wasn't only money, it was continuity. And continuity required that certain stories remain unprovable. You can see the logic of it in the way documents are written. The estate office never says, "We are erasing our past." It says adjustments. It says review. It says preventive removal. Words designed to sound like stewardship while functioning like control. If someone had asked directly, the answer would have been polite. The books are being cared for. The collection is being stabilized. The library is being maintained. And technically, that would be true, because the point of the operation wasn't destruction. The point was order. The kind of order that keeps a scandal from acquiring a date, keeps a rumor from acquiring a signature, keeps a hidden heir from acquiring proof. That's why the next discovery isn't found in the library at all. It's found in the money. The team begins tracing routine payments connected to the house, binding work, carpentry, climate regulation, the predictable costs of keeping a mansion from decaying into embarrassment. Then, nested among those line items, they find the phrase that doesn't belong to maintenance: reorganization of collection. It appears more than once, separated by months, sometimes years, as if the library was periodically reordered in response to something external: an inheritance shift, a marriage, a death, a threat that arrived in an envelope and never stayed in the drawing room long enough to be noticed. The amount isn't trivial. It's not the kind of payment you make for dusting or shelf repair. It's the kind you make when you hire expertise, someone who understands paper, someone who understands cataloging, someone who can manipulate what exists without leaving a visible wound. It reads like an investment, not in preservation, in revision. And in the Gilded Age, revision was a domestic skill. There were always ways to manage what the public could see. Families cultivated friendly press, hosted charity events that functioned as reputational armor, placed flattering stories like velvet curtains over uglier truths. If something surfaced, an accusation, a lawsuit, an indiscreet visitor, there were counters. A donation announcement, a sudden marriage engagement, a social column filled with delightful details that made yesterday's suspicion feel impolite to repeat. But the private archive, letters, marginal notes, dedications, was more volatile than the press. Newspapers can be argued with. A handwritten dedication cannot. A folded confession cannot. A ledger name cannot, especially once it connects to a face on a wall. So the family treated the library the way a bank treats risk, by reducing exposure, by removing the instruments that could be used against them, by making the evidence vanish while leaving the institution intact. The restorers lay the financial ledger beside the altered volumes, and the two begin to speak to each other with the same tone. The money suggests scheduling, the cuts suggest method, the administrative language suggests awareness, and the portrait inventory suggests a broader policy, one that didn't just erase words, but curated visibility. The Whitneys weren't just maintaining a library, they were maintaining a version of themselves. If you've ever worked around old wealth, you know how this happens without anyone needing to say the obvious part out loud. An attorney uses careful phrasing. Unnecessary. Exposure. An heir nods, eyes on the window rather than the page. A trustee clears his throat and shifts the conversation to household organization, as if the house itself is the issue. An estate manager takes notes that never include names, only tasks. There is no vote, no dramatic decree, only consensus, arriving like dusk, quietly, and all at once. And once consensus exists, it becomes policy. A domestic policy doesn't require letterhead, it requires repetition. It requires staff who understand what not to record. It requires vendors who do their work discreetly and accept payment without asking why. It requires that the changes feel normal inside the house. That's why the phrase reorganization of collection is so chilling. It doesn't read like a one-time emergency. It reads like a recurring procedure, like the family periodically checked its own archive the way it checked its locks. The team tests this idea the only way you can test something built to resist scrutiny, by following the sequence of edits across time. They map dates of reorganization against the physical pattern of missing pages. They compare those against other quiet changes in estate records, rekeying, storage adjustments, shipments of blank paper, bindery invoices with no specified titles. A timeline begins to form, not perfect, but suggestive. Each time the family faced a moment of instability, an estate transfer, a contested marriage settlement, the death of a patriarch, the library seems to undergo another wave of order. The Gilded Age loved order. It loved the illusion that everything was placed correctly, named correctly, framed correctly. But the order that matters here is darker, the order of selective memory. Because once a family invests money in rearranging its past, it accepts something most people refuse to face. It accepts that truth is a permanent risk. Not a one-time embarrassment, not an isolated rumor, but a living threat that can reappear when someone opens the wrong cover at the wrong time. A mansion can be renovated, a reputation can be rehearsed, but a sentence written in pencil in a margin can survive longer than the people who tried to bury it. And this is where the story becomes less about what was removed and more about who had the authority to remove it. The restorers return to that crossed-out portrait entry and look for the handwriting. They find it again in a different context, an estate-related note, a quiet instruction in the margin of a financial sheet. The strokes match, the way the writer makes certain letters narrow, the way the ink darkens at the end of a line as if the pen lingered. It suggests a hand that belonged in the decision circle, someone close enough to classify a face as displayable or forbidden, someone who could translate fear into procedure. In the library, they walk the north wall and study it as a stage. The paneling shows faint differences in sheen where frames once hung, tiny nail holes filled and stained. Over. The carpet beneath one section has a slightly different wear pattern, as if people once paused there frequently, drawn to something important. Now the wall is respectable, empty in the right places. The absence looks intentional. And then, almost as if the mansion wants to remind them who controls access, they notice something that contradicts the clean narrative of architecture. Near the baseboard, behind a row of shelves that should be flush, the molding carries a hairline seam, not a crack from age. A seam, like a join. The kind of join you'd see where a panel can be lifted, where a compartment can be opened, where a door can exist without appearing on any public plan. A conservator kneels, not hurried, and runs a gloved finger along the seam. The glove catches on a faint ridge. A small metal fastener glints in the shadow, old, dull, carefully placed. The room doesn't change dramatically. It doesn't need to. The silence thickens in the way it does when everyone sees the same thing and chooses not to speak first. Because if the Whitneys censored their own books, then the library wasn't merely edited, it was engineered. And if it was engineered, then the next piece of proof won't be in a missing page at all. It will be behind whatever that seam was built to hide. The seam behind the shelving has the wrong kind of calm. It sits there like a practiced secret, a detail built to be missed by anyone who came only to admire the room. The conservator's glove lingers a moment longer than it needs to, then withdraws, because you don't pry at old money the way you pry at ordinary walls. You document first. You cross-check. You ask whether you're looking at a singular oddity or a familiar technique wearing a different family name. And that's when the Whitney Library stops feeling isolated. Not because anyone wants to make accusations. In this world, accusation is messy, and messy things attract attention. What emerges instead is correlation. The quiet, structural kind that shows up when specialists have seen the same wound in more than one archive. A book with its dedication neatly lifted. A diary whose most intimate year is missing. A letterpress memoir with gaps that occur exactly where names tend to appear. In isolation, each case can be explained away. Humidity, poor handling, repairs, unfortunate deterioration. But when the patterns repeat across dynasties, across houses built by different fortunes, across decades that share the same social anxieties, the excuses begin to feel rehearsed. Archivists who work with Gilded Age collections recognize the choreography. They'll tell you carefully that certain sections of private libraries are more likely to show selective losses, front matter, end papers, the final leaves, the places where relationships leave fingerprints. They'll point to the way some volumes carry a faint rectangular discoloration, an insert once pasted in place, later removed, leaving only the shadow of what was there. They'll show you catalog cards with overwritten notations, as if a title was once cross-referenced and later quietly severed from its original context. They'll describe diaries that survive with immaculate bindings but suspiciously clean margins, the kind of cleanliness that doesn't happen by accident in a house where people lived around paper for generations. And again, we're not talking about the destruction of ideas. We're talking about the control of proximity, the control of who knew whom, who stood close enough to write in someone else's book, who signed their name on a private page. who left a comment that might later turn into evidence of a hidden heir, a forbidden room, a financial favor that never belonged in a public ledger. This is how intellectual control works in old money families, not by banning thought, but by severing the threads that tie thought to people. The Gilded Age was an era of public display and private engineering. These mansions hosted dinners where conversation was a performance, and yet in the side rooms, the libraries, the studies, the estate offices, conversation became strategy. A library wasn't just where you learned what the world thought. It was where you stored what the world must not learn about you. The moment you accept that, the Whitney Library's edited silence begins to look less like an anomaly and more like a recognizable behavior within a class that treated reputation as an asset. You can feel the same logic in how these families handled the press. They didn't need to silence every journalist. They only needed to shape the conditions under which stories traveled. A favorable editor invited into comfort. A society columnist fed a prettier narrative. A philanthropic announcement timed to swallow an ugly rumor. The public story becomes controllable when the private proof becomes scarce. And private proof, letters, dedications, marginalia, often lived in the one place that moved freely through a house: books. That's why Golden Age secrets survive so well in paper. Paper is intimate, portable, deniable. A letter can be burned, yes, but burning leaves gaps that look like guilt. A page removed cleanly leaves a book that still looks dignified on the shelf. A diary with a missing year can be blamed on misplacement. A dedication erased can be blamed on restoration. The language is always the same: preservation, adjustment, reorganization. Words that sound like care, used as cover for control. When researchers compare collections across old families, one of the most telling details isn't what's missing, it's how the missing is handled. Some houses show raw absence, torn leaves, jagged stubs, a sense of urgency. Others show something else entirely: quiet precision, replacement sheets toned to match, gaps that are almost polite. That second category suggests a domestic policy, not a moment of panic. It suggests a family that accepted the truth as a permanent risk and built routines to manage it. And that's why the Whitney Mansion feels less like a single story and more like a case study. It's not the only library where pages were deliberately removed. It's simply one of the few where the pattern is still visible enough to be read. Back in the present, the restoration team moves differently now. They stop treating the remaining books as neutral survivors. Every intact volume becomes a question. Is it untouched because it was harmless, or untouched because it was never consulted in? The family's private economy? Every clean dedication becomes suspicious not because it exists, but because it was allowed to remain. Every gap in a catalog record becomes a potential act of domestic editing. The mansion hasn't changed, but the way you look at it has. Recognizing the pattern rewires the room. A camera clicks. A page turns slower. Someone marks a shelf map with small dots, clusters, roots, concentrations, turning the library into a grid of probability. The seam behind the shelving is photographed again, closer this time, light-angled to reveal the join. The team compares it to old renovation invoices, then to the reorganization of collection payments, then to the vague maintenance notes that avoided calling missing pages damage. They aren't chasing a scandal, they're chasing a method. Because once you see the wider pattern, other libraries, the same silence, you stop asking what was removed, and you begin asking the question that actually matters. Who had the authority to decide what remained? And that authority rarely belonged to a single person. It belonged to a domestic machine, heirs who needed stability, lawyers who needed deniability, administrators who needed the paper trail to look clean, and staff trained to keep their eyes lowered. A system built to outlive individuals. A system that turns books into silent witnesses and then makes sure they never testify. So when the team returns to the Whitney shelves and stands again at the north wall, the seam no longer feels like a strange detail. It feels like a familiar solution, one used in other houses, other dynasties, other eras when paper became dangerous. A place to store what you cannot burn. A place to hide what you cannot legally destroy. A place to keep a dark legacy close, but out of sight. And as the lamp skims the molding, the join catches the light one last time. Thin, deliberate, and just above it, almost lost in the grain of the wood, a penciled inventory number appears. Partly erased, as if someone tried to remove even the idea that the compartment was ever cataloged. The penciled inventory number above the seam is the kind of detail that makes professionals go quiet for reasons they don't dramatize. A number means a system once acknowledged the compartment. A partly erased number means someone later decided the acknowledgement was the real risk. The room doesn't feel haunted, it feels managed, and in the present, with cameras, gloves, and clipboards, the most uncomfortable truth is that restoration itself can become a second kind of editing. They bring the altered volumes back to the central table, not as curiosities now, but as evidence. Under the soft wash of conservation lights, the missing leaves look almost clean, too clean gaps that invite the modern impulse to fix. There are standard techniques for that: inserting neutral paper, reconstructing a missing leaf, stabilizing the hinge so the absence doesn't spread. You can make a book look whole. Again, you can make a shelf look calm, and in most historic collections, that's the point. Repair, preserve, prolong. But here, every repair risks becoming an accomplice. The dilemma surfaces in small gestures. A conservator lays a replacement sheet beside a volume and then doesn't pick it up. Someone flips through a book and stops at the blank space where a dedication should be, letting the empty hinge sit open a moment longer than necessary, as if the absence has weight. The room answers with tiny sounds, paper settling, a pencil rolling, the faint click of a camera shutter, while the staff realizes the question isn't technical at all. It's narrative. If you rebuild what was removed, you may restore an object, but you might erase the proof that it was censored. If you preserve the emptiness, you preserve the wound, and the wound is telling you something the Whitneys paid to silence. An internal opinion memo appears, circulated the way these things are circulated, quietly, without ceremony. The language is restrained, almost clinical, but the recommendation lands like a moral instruction. Do not interfere with the absence. Preserve the gaps as they are. Document them. Stabilize the binding, yes, but leave the missing pages missing. The emptiness is part of the artifact. The silence is part of the archive. It's a strange kind of respect, not for the family, but for the evidence. Because the mansion is already full of beautifully preserved surfaces. What's rare here is the moment when a surface fails and reveals the mechanism beneath it. A blank leaf where a confession might have been. A clean cut near a spine where a name once lived. A replaced sheet toned to match that no longer fools anyone. Those are not accidents. Those are decisions that survived long enough to be witnessed. And once the team accepts that, their relationship to the library shifts again. The books stop being literature and become testimony. The estate logs stop being routine and become strategy. The reorganization of collection payments stop being housekeeping and become investment in denial. The crossed-out portrait entry stops being an inventory mistake and becomes a domestic policy. Visibility is curated, memory is managed. What would you do if you discovered that silence is also part of the record? That question hangs in the room longer than anyone wants it to, because it isn't only about the past. It's about what institutions do now, what museums display, what archives redact, what families donate with conditions attached, what gets cataloged vaguely so it can be forgotten later. In the Gilded Age, power learned to hide in paper. In the present, power can hide in procedure. So the team begins documenting the absences with a kind of discipline that feels almost like defiance. They measure each missing leaf. They photograph each cut edge under angled light to capture the blade's path. They note where adhesive shadows suggest inserts once lived. They map the shelves where gaps cluster. They treat the empty spaces as if they are text, because in a library like this, repetition becomes language. And repetition is what changes everything. When one book is missing a dedication, you can call it misfortune. When dozens are missing the same kinds of pages, front matter, margins, final leaves, you begin to see policy. When the administrative records never call it damage, and the finances quietly fund reorganization, and the portrait inventory hides a face, you begin to see a pattern that doesn't belong to time, it belongs to intent. The void stops being absence. It becomes evidence. Near the end of the day, someone returns to the north wall again, standing where the portrait once likely hung, eyes traveling over the paneling until they find the seam and the half-erased number above it. A small flashlight beam moves along the molding, catching the join, catching the fastener, catching the faint graphite that someone tried to rub away. And just for a moment, the light grazes something else. A thin scuff on the floorboard near the base, like the trace of a cabinet that used to shift, or a panel that used to open more often than the house would ever admit. No one pries it open yet. They don't have to. Not tonight. Because the story has already crossed a point of no return. The silence is repeating, and repetition is never neutral. And in the Whitney Mansion's library, the heaviest evidence isn't what you can read. It's the place where reading was prevented again and again until the emptiness learned to speak. When you stand in the Whitney Mansion's library long enough, the grandeur begins to feel like a tactic. The carved wood, the gleam of brass, the disciplined rows of gilt spines, everything is designed to suggest permanence, to imply that knowledge here is safe, inherited, and complete. But the closer you get, the more the room tells a different story. That knowledge, for the Gilded Age elite, wasn't merely collected. It was managed, curated, used. A mutilated library doesn't just reveal what was cut from paper. It reveals what the household believed was dangerous in the first place. Not the arguments of the books, but the evidence hidden around them. Names in front matter, penciled notes in margins, folded letters pressed into end papers. The fragile truths that turn culture into testimony. In a room built to broadcast refinement, the most important content was often the content nobody was meant to see, because it pointed to relationships, obligations, and private conflict that could fracture the public image the family spent generations polishing. That contrast is the revelation, and it's quieter than scandal. The more imposing the archive, the more vulnerable its truth can be. A library like this looks like a monument to American confidence, yet it behaves like a nervous system, reacting, concealing, cutting away stimuli that threaten the family's control. The Golden Age secrets aren't hidden in theatrical vaults. They're hidden in habits, in the repeated decision to preserve the object while removing the proof, in the calm administrative language that refuses to call missing pages damage, in the money quietly spent to reorganize a past that wasn't supposed to rearrange itself. And the consequence doesn't stay inside the mansion, because if old money treated private libraries as sensitive archives, then part of American history may have been read incomplete from the beginning, not because the documents never existed, but because the most compromising fragments were separated from circulation before scholars, journalists, or even heirs could question them. A public narrative grows stronger when private contradictions disappear. A family legend becomes easier to repeat when marginal notes are gone. A disputed lineage becomes harder to prove when dedications vanish. A dark legacy becomes survivable when the paper trail turns polite and blank. That's the unsettling power of erased records. They don't just remove information. They shape what feels true by limiting what can be verified. And once verification becomes impossible, the official version gains weight simply by being the only version left standing. The Gilded Age understood that long before the rest of the country admitted it. Wealth didn't only buy influence, it bought time, procedure, and the ability to make absence look like nature. Back at the restoration table, the team closes a volume and the cover lands with a soft, controlled thud, final but not satisfying. A blank gap remains inside like a held breath. They slide the book into a protective cradle, label it, and the label feels almost ironic. Preserved, when what's preserved is the proof of what was removed. Around them, the mansion remains composed, offering beauty the way it always has, as if beauty alone can settle the question. And yet, on the north wall, the seam behind the shelving is still there, thin, deliberate, beneath the half-erased inventory number that insists someone once cataloged what they later tried to forget. The lamp's beam drifts across the join one more time, catching the faint ridge, catching the old fastener, catching the suggestion of a door that doesn't appear on any public plan, and the room returns to silence so complete it feels like it's waiting to see whether you'll open it. Once the team accepts that the Whitney Library's absences are deliberate, a second question arrives, quieter and more, unsettling. What did those absences allow the world to believe? Because in the Gilded Age, families didn't merely live private lives and then accidentally become public legends. They manufactured their own permanence. They curated the language that would survive them, the speeches that would be quoted, the biographies that would be shelved in other people's libraries as history. So the restorers begin cross-checking, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. They lay the altered volumes, alongside public-facing material about the Whitneys, commemorative addresses, published reminiscences, authorized profiles, the kind of polished family narrative that appears in museum programs and civic tributes. The effect is subtle at first. The tone matches, the themes repeat, the rough edges never appear. The family's public memory aligns almost too smoothly with what remains readable on their shelves. It's not that these public texts contain lies in the obvious sense. They contain something more refined, a story that has been narrowed until it becomes inevitable. The same philanthropic arc, the same respectable friendships, the same carefully framed hardships that never implicate anyone specific. Names appear where names are safe. Controversy is referenced only as a difficult period. Conflicts become differences of opinion. The biographies move through time like a carriage gliding over cobblestones, shaken only enough to look authentic, never enough to spill the truth. And then the team notices what's missing. Not from the books this time, but from the public record. The topics that would normally live in front matter and margins, the personal ties, the awkward proximity to scandal, the visitor's remark that changes the interpretation of a whole year, do not appear anywhere else. Not in the published memoirs, not in the civic speeches, not in the glossy history of the house summaries. It's as if the removed material didn't merely vanish from paper, it vanished from narrative altogether. The family's public discourse reads like a room where certain doors were never built, and that is the partial revelation that lands hardest. Private censorship doesn't stay private. It shapes what culture considers known. In the Gilded Age, this was easier than people like to admit. A family with old money didn't need to censor newspapers directly. It only needed to control source material. If the most compromising paper never circulated, if the dedications were gone, the marginalia erased, the letters removed, then historians, journalists, and even well-meaning admirers would be forced to build their accounts from what remained, and what remained would, inevitably, flatter the architecture of power. The record becomes a mirror that reflects the family's chosen angle. You can feel that mechanism operating when you read the language of public praise. The speeches are full of certainty, integrity, vision, service, duty. Words that sound sturdy because they don't require evidence. They don't need footnotes. They don't need marginal notes in a private hand. Meanwhile, the library's missing pages hint at the opposite, that the most dangerous truths were specific, personal, and therefore provable. A name that shouldn't have been connected to another name. A note that revealed motive. An insert that recorded an agreement. A trace that suggested a hidden heir. A forbidden room. A bargain made in silence. Those are the kinds of truths that don't survive. Long in a household that understands reputation as inheritance. This is where the cultural consequence becomes unavoidable. When censorship happens at the source, the public story doesn't just become incomplete. It becomes authoritative by default. and the Whitney case begins to look like a blueprint. Remove the evidence quietly, fund reorganization, write the public version with confidence, and let the country learn the family through a narrative that can no longer be challenged. A dark legacy doesn't need to be defended if the paper that could contradict it is already gone. Back in the library, the team's work becomes almost paradoxical. They are preserving objects while also documenting their injuries, because the injuries may be the only surviving map to what was erased. Each clean cut becomes a coordinate. Each adhesive shadow becomes a clue. Each blank where a dedication should have been becomes a boundary line around a relationship the public was never meant to confirm. The mansion's beauty remains intact, but now it feels like a stage set after the actors have left. Props arranged perfectly, the script already decided, and yet the floorboards still holding the marks of what was moved. And that's the transition that prepares the ending of this investigation. If the truth was pulled from the pages, it may only be rebuilt by studying the gaps with the seriousness we usually reserve for text. The narrative won't be recovered in a single found letter or a dramatic confession. It will be recovered in the pattern, the repetition, the consistency, the places where silence appears too precisely to be natural. The camera returns to the north wall one more time. The seam behind the shelving sits in its practiced stillness, the half-erased inventory number hovering above it like a warning that someone tried to delete even the fact that it existed. The light catches the join, then the old fastener, then the faint scuff on the floorboard as if something heavy used to shift there. And the room holds its breath in a way no room should, because if the family removed truth from paper, whatever remains may be waiting behind the one door the public story insists was never there. In the present, the Whitney Mansion's library looks ready to be trusted again. The lighting is controlled, the temperature steady, the shelves aligned as if alignment alone can promise honesty. Visitors would walk in and assume they are seeing inheritance, a preserved room, preserved knowledge, preserved America. Researchers would request access and feel that familiar quiet thrill, the sense that the past is waiting politely to be read. And that's the risk, because the more beautiful the archive, the easier it becomes to forget that beauty can be a mask. An edited collection doesn't announce itself the way a burned one does. Fire leaves drama, water leaves stains, mold leaves a smell, but a blade leaves something more insidious. A book that still looks complete from the outside. A library that still photographs well. A narrative that still reads smoothly because its contradictions have been physically removed. This is what the modern world inherits here. An archive that has already been negotiated by someone else's fear. The restoration team knows it. You can see it in how they handle the volumes now, the way a hand pauses before opening a cover that seems harmless, the way eyes travel first to the hinge, searching for the telltale sign of a cut near the spine. Their notes have changed tone. They no longer write only about condition. They write about intent. They write about patterns. They write about what cannot be restored, only acknowledged. Because the partial revelation that settles over the table is not dramatic. It's final. There is no way to recover everything that was removed. The missing inserts are gone. The erased marginal notes are not waiting in some friendly public archive. The lifted dedications won't reappear in a box labeled neatly with a date. Whatever those pages contained, names, admissions, quiet bargains, the kind of proof that turns rumor into history, has likely already done what it was meant to do, disappear without leaving a second copy. And that produces a strange ethical pressure in the present, one that museums and institutions rarely say out loud. If you accept the library as it is, you risk accepting the victory of silence. You risk repeating the family's preferred story simply because it is the only one left intact. You risk letting a dark legacy remain elegant, clean, curated, and unchallenged. But if you question the absences, if you treat the gaps as evidence rather than inconvenience, you return complexity to the historical record. You refuse to let the Gilded Age's private policy become the modern world's public truth. That is what makes this room feel heavier than a room full of books should feel. It's not only the age of the paper, It's the awareness that someone once anticipated future readers and prepared the archive accordingly. The Whitneys, or whoever acted in their name, understood what scholars understand now. History is built from what survives. Control what survives, and you can shape what is believed. It's a technique old money perfected long before anyone called it narrative management. So the team shifts from restoration to reckoning. They begin labeling absences the way you label artifacts: leaf removed, blade cut, near hinge, end paper lifted, adhesive shadow, front matter excised, dedication missing. They photograph every gap as if it were a sentence. They cross-reference the physical evidence with the estate's vague administrative language, with the reorganization of collection payments, with the portrait inventory that hid a face, with the penciled inventory number above a seam that someone tried to erase. They build a map of silence, and the map starts to feel like a second catalog, one the family never intended anyone to compile. This is the risk of reading only what's left. You don't just miss facts. You inherit someone else's conclusions. You inherit the softened edges, the clean biographies, the public speeches that align too perfectly with the sanitized shelves. You inherit the version of events that becomes official, not because it is complete, but because it is uncontested. And the moment you recognize that, every intact spine becomes suspicious in a different way. Not because every book is compromised, but because every book is now part of a system that has already proven it can be edited. Outside the mansion, the modern world keeps doing what it always does with old wealth, turning it into culture. A preserved room becomes a tour. A family story becomes civic pride. A library becomes a symbol. And symbols are easy to love because they ask nothing complicated from you. But the Whitney Library is no longer just a symbol once you've seen the cuts. It's a warning about how easily a nation can learn itself through incomplete pages. The Gilded Age believed in permanence. It built stone, it built institutions, it built legacy. But here, permanence took a quieter form. The permanence of an absence repeated until it becomes normal. That is the most unsettling inheritance this room offers. An edited archive passed down as if it were neutral. Near closing time, the restoration lights dim slightly, and the shadows return to their older shape. The books are secured. The memos are filed. The table is cleared with the careful efficiency of people who know they are leaving a question open overnight. One last photograph is taken of the north wall, not for aesthetic documentation, but for evidence. The seam behind the shelving sits in place like a held secret. The half-erased inventory number above it remains faintly visible, refusing to disappear completely, as if the house itself can't decide whether it wants to confess or deny. And as the room settles back into silence, the scuff on the floorboard catches. The light one more time, just enough to suggest that something heavy once moved there often, and that whatever was hidden behind that wall wasn't meant to be read by anyone who only ever trusted what was left on the shelf. The restoration lights dim first, then the room seems to choose its own darkness. Gloves are removed, pencils capped, and the day's photographs are filed with a restraint that feels almost ceremonial. Each image a quiet admission that the Whitney Mansion's library did not simply lose pages to time. It was edited, deliberately, methodically, and the most unsettling feature of such a place is not what it reveals, but what it normalizes. A history made respectable by subtraction. Along the north wall, the shelving stands as it always has, disciplined, immaculate, composed for visitors who prefer their past complete. Yet the seam remains, thin as a breath, and above it the half-erased inventory number still clings to the wood grain, as if someone once tried to remove even the right to ask questions. The books return to their cradles with their absences intact. The ledgers return to their folders with their language softened. The portrait list remains crossed through where a face should be. Nothing in the room moves, except the certainty that something here was arranged to outlast scrutiny. This is what a mutilated library leaves behind. Not answers, but a structure of intent. When pages disappear, it is never only paper that goes missing. It is context. It is proximity. It is the dangerous clarity that comes from names written in the wrong margins. And if one family could invest money to reorganize its own past, then the question no longer belongs to the Whitneys alone. It belongs to every Gilded Age archive we have inherited with gratitude, without asking who decided what would remain. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet omissions, let it be known. If this investigation resonated with you, let us know, so the algorithm understands these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury, and sometimes a careful interpretation becomes the only lantern left in a corridor built for silence. And remain with us. Subscribe, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens, because beyond these shelves there are other libraries, other inventories, other reorganizations, and other rooms that do not appear on any public plan. And if you are, willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. If you wish to continue analyzing what the elite preferred to tear from paper, remain with us. Because at times, what is missing speaks more loudly than everything that was preserved. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.